My original ultimate guide to Windows Autopilot video is now over 2 years old, and a lot has changed in that time. In truth, I've been meaning to update it for a while, but I knew there was something new that was just around the corner from Microsoft, and so I waited for that to be released first. That is called Windows Autopilot Device Preparation, and we will cover that in this video. But first, let's cover Windows Autopilot in Microsoft Intune step by step. I don't remember all of the requirements for Windows Autopilot off the top of my head. There are lots of requirements. Normally it'll work just fine as long as you have the prerequisites in place, but a great place to start is the Microsoft documentation. So we'll head there. We'll go to this URL here, which is learn.microsoft.com/yourlanguage/autopilot/requirements. And I've gone for this one here. I'll put the link in the description below, obviously. So this is a great place to start. They've actually laid it out pretty well, and they've been doing this for quite a while, so it does make sense that they've got it sorted out. There are some software requirements. We need to be using a supported version of Windows 11 or Windows 10. So as long as we have Windows 11 Pro, Pro Education, Pro for Workstations, Enterprise or Education, you'll be able to use Windows Autopilot. At least that's regarding the actual version of Windows you're installing. There are some more prerequisites. Oh, if you are using HoloLens, do let me know if you use Autopilot. I've never heard of that actually being used, but it is possible to do Windows Autopilot for HoloLens. I'd love to meet you. Next, networking. So there are some networking requirements. Obviously, this service is a cloud-based service. If you've ever heard any of the training videos around Autopilot, it says Windows Autopilot is a cloud-based service for enrolling devices. We need to be able to have these devices access the internet. So they need to access the internet because they need to access Intune, Entra ID, in order to get information about the tenant and actually enroll the devices. So, for example, well, even here it says Windows Autopilot depends on various internet-based services. That is absolutely true. We'll scroll down and you can see it says Windows Autopilot Deployment Service needs these URLs here, which they don't make sense. It's ztd.dds.microsoft.com and cs.dds.microsoft.com. Those are the URLs it will try to access, so you need to make sure it can contact those. Windows Activation requires its own activation services, there are loads of URLs that need that. Really, it needs unrestricted access to the internet in most cases. So aside from connectivity, if you have the internet open to it outbound, then we're all good. Licensing. You need to have a license that includes Windows Autopilot. Sounds obvious, but not all licenses from Microsoft include Windows Autopilot. Most of them do, actually. So Business Premium, F1 or F3, Academic, A1, A3, A5, E3 or E5, EMS, E3 and E5, Intune for Education, Entra ID P1 and P2, or a Microsoft Intune subscription. And crucially, what we don't see here is Office 365 E1, E3 or E5. If you just have Office 365 E3, E5, you just have email and SharePoint and Teams and all that kind of stuff. You don't have anything to do with device management and security, or even most of the identity security stuff isn't included in that. So be sure to check your licensing. Make sure you've got one of these Microsoft 365 licenses. And certainly if you want to use Autopilot, it needs to be one of these here. Okay, so aside from that, configuration. We need to do some configuration. In Intune, you need to have configured Entra Automatic Enrollment. I'll show you that in a moment. And we also need to make sure that the first user who signs in needs to have Entra Join permissions in order to do the Entra Join, because it actually joins as the user. We also have some optional but recommended configurations. So automatically stepping up from Windows Pro to Windows Enterprise, changing the edition in Windows. Normally you'll receive a device from a manufacturer, Dell, Lenovo, HP, Toshiba, all those different manufacturers will provide you a device with Windows Pro, not Enterprise, and you need to actually activate Windows Enterprise in order for that to work. It will normally be a seamless step up, but you need to configure that. That's one thing you can configure. I'm not going to cover that in this video. I'll cover it separately. Next, Entra Custom Branding. Now, I have configured custom branding in Entra because I like it. It's one of the things I cover in most of my YouTube videos. but it's not required for Autopilot. It just makes it look pretty. It's something you should probably do in your organization. You should probably do it in your organization anyway, not just for Autopilot. It's a really good way to make users feel like you've customized their tenant and it's branded for them. So I'm not going to cover that in this video. I'm going to keep this video pretty focused on Windows Autopilot. And then you also have other requirements like device registration, profile configuration. These are required. I do actually need to go through those, and I definitely will. Now, I mentioned that my Autopilot Ultimate Guide video is 2 years old. That's nothing compared to the video that Microsoft put out and have linked to this page. This one here, I'll just scroll through it. You can see it's still using the old Azure portal, and it is 6 years old. Anyway, so I don't feel too bad that I've put out a 2-year-old video and it's still getting views. This one will cover all of the changes and everything you need to know in order to get started step by step. Okay, over to Intune. Now, let's assume you have licensing. I can't help you with that. I've told you it's licensing to get. Speak to your partner, get licensing, or get a trial. Job done. Let's assume you're going to use Windows Pro when you're building the machine. Let's assume the basics are covered from that perspective. The stuff I can't control, the stuff I can't help you with. Get the right things in place. But let's configure the things that we actually need to do in Intune. So the first thing we need to configure is a group of devices that can do Autopilot, because not all devices in the world are going to be able to use Autopilot into your tenant. So we need to actually configure which devices can do that. Now I will caveat that in Autopilot v2 and Autopilot device preparation, that is slightly changed, but at least in the traditional and normal version of Autopilot, you need to actually specify which devices can use Autopilot. So let's do that. We'll first start with a group. So we'll go to groups, and in groups we'll choose new group, and this normally should be a dynamic device group. The reason it should be dynamic is that when you add a device to the Autopilot service, you don't want to actually have to also add it to the to this group in order for it to use Autopilot. So let me show you what I mean. We'll call this group Windows Autopilot devices. It's a pretty good idea to say what they are. And this group contains Windows Autopilot devices. Now, I don't want to assign Entra role to this group, and if you do, then you also can't make it dynamic, so we should choose no here. And I'm going to choose dynamic device because we want devices to be automatically put in this group when we need them to. I'm not going to set an owner, and this is different to Windows Autopilot v2 and device prep. We don't need an owner for this group. And we're going to add a dynamic query. Now, the query could be something like the device is Windows 11, or the device is Windows 10, or anything really, but the one we probably should use is the one that Microsoft recommend, and it's a way of identifying devices that have been it's a way of identifying devices that have been added to the Windows Autopilot device service. So I'll show you what I mean. I'll go into the documentation and choose how-to guides and then create device groups. Down here you can see that if we create an Autopilot device group, we need to use this string here in the expressions. So if we just want to get all devices that are in the Autopilot device service, we can just use this one. Device.physicalIDs starts with ZTDID. We'll grab that and add the expression. Nope. We'll grab that, choose edit, and in here we'll put the rule syntax just there. Now it does seem to copy perfectly well from the Microsoft Learn documentation. We don't need to fix these characters, but you might need to depending on the browser that you're copying from. Just be aware. So we'll choose OK, and then we'll choose save, and this will add all devices that are registered into Autopilot into this group. Right now, there's probably none. Dynamic device groups aren't immediate anyway, so I can't check right now, but it probably contains none. I don't think I've got any devices in my list. Let's check. We'll go into devices, down to device onboarding and enrollment, and then we'll scroll right down on this list to devices, and in devices we'll see which devices we've got. I do have a device in Autopilot. So it would get put into that group. Let's ignore that for a second. I'm going to go back to enrollment and show you this section here, because this is pretty much the next step. So we have some enrollment options, and these are the first 7 things we need to consider within Autopilot. Firstly, I mentioned automatic enrollment. We need that to be done. So let's choose automatic enrollment. And actually, it takes us over to Entra. You can get to this from Microsoft Entra. This is a different view into it, but it's still the same place. So with the MDM user scope does need to be either some and include a user who you're going to use to do Autopilot with, or all. Normally, it's all, because we allow all users to enroll devices, typically. But you might want to specify just some. We then have the WIP user scope, the Windows Information Protection user scope. This here should not be all. It's not recommended to have this set to all, because there could be a scenario where the device doesn't know whether it should enroll a device or configure them to use Windows Information Protection. So we should probably, unless we're using Windows Information Protection, set it to none. And there is some information, and I will link some information in the description below about why that's a problem and how to fix it if you do need to use Windows Information Protection. But if you're just configuring Autopilot and you're not using Windows Information Protection, just set this to all and then none. Go back to device enrollment. Now, we typically don't need to configure CNAME validation. It will probably have already been done for your tenant. You can test it by typing in your domain name here. And if it tests it and it comes back as a green tick, then it works fine. If it doesn't, you need to configure the CNAME in DNS. I'm not going to go through that right now with you. If it doesn't work in your tenant, go ahead and fix it. There's loads of documentation in there about how to do that. I'm going to close that down. Next, co-management. I'm not using co-management in this environment. I'm using an Intune only environment. Co-management is about config manager. So if you have devices that are managed by configuration manager and you want to start using Intune for them, you would configure co-management, unrelated to Windows Autopilot. Next, device platform restrictions. This is almost related to Windows Autopilot, so we'll go into it, because we could specify which devices are allowed to use Intune and then roll into Intune. If I go into the device platform restrictions and then go into this default one that I see here, the one that's called all users, and in properties, we'll see that actually all of the platforms are listed: Android, iOS, Mac OS, and Windows. And you can see I've got platforms that are allowed. So all the Windows platform is allowed, and personally owned is blocked. That means if someone tries to enroll a device that isn't registered in my tenant, then it can be considered personally owned and they can't enroll it. So in this case, Windows devices are allowed, but personally owned Windows devices are not. That will work perfectly fine for Autopilot V1, the normal version of Autopilot we're talking about today. That will work perfectly fine. So back to enrollment restrictions and back to enrollment. Device limit restrictions, very simple. You can set a limit to how many devices a user can enroll. It's set to 15 by default. I don't have many users that have 15 devices. Only when I get into sort of more in-depth testing with Autopilot do I ever hit that limit. So be aware of that when you're testing, but otherwise you don't need to configure that for Autopilot. Enrollment notifications, it's possible to set enrollment notifications so that when a user enrolls a device or a device gets enrolled as a user, that user is notified, admins are notified, we're all told that stuff is happening in the environment. It's a great idea, but it's not required for Autopilot, so we're not going to cover it. Windows Hello for Business. It is a good idea to configure Windows Hello for Business in your environment. It is a better credential than just username and password. It's not related to Windows Autopilot. I'm not going to configure it within this demonstration. Windows Autopilot device preparation. Handily, right at the top here, they've stuck it in the middle between the enrollment stuff and the actual Windows Autopilot stuff that I need to talk about. So I'll have to cover it right now. It is the next thing that's being released for Autopilot. I will cover it later in this video. It will allow us to enroll devices in a different way, slightly quicker, slightly better maybe, we'll see. But let's wait till later in the video to talk about that. Windows Autopilot. This is it, we're here. So now we need to configure which devices can use Windows Autopilot. We need to configure some deployment profiles. We need to configure enrollment status pages. And then if we are using hybrid devices, which we're not, we could configure Intune connector for Active Directory. So let's start right at the top. Devices. I showed you earlier on that I have a device already, and you put a device in here by importing it. Now, it isn't really easy to add a device to this list. When I choose import, I have to use a CSV, and I'll explain what needs to be in that CSV in a little while. But the idea is that it's not easy to put devices into this list. Microsoft have made it intentionally difficult for you to add devices into the Autopilot devices list because that's not how you should be using it. You shouldn't be adding devices into this list manually by typing things into this list. That's not a good way to use Autopilot. This was originally designed as a way to provision devices that have been provided by a manufacturer or a partner to the user. You shouldn't be typing stuff into this list at all. In fact, the only time you need to interact with this list is when you buy new devices from a reseller who isn't able to put them in this list for you already. Or when you're testing it. Like in this example here, I'm going to have to show you how to add a device to the list in order to demonstrate it for you. But normally, you wouldn't be responsible for adding stuff into this list in a day-to-day usage of Autopilot. So let's get a device into this list to start with. So let's import some devices, right? Let's choose import. Now, my concern with this page here that gets presented on the right-hand side is that it's very confusing. It talks about assigning users to the CSV. It doesn't tell you what the CSV should look like or how it should work. In fact, when you click on learn more about the formatting requirements, you get told that you can add devices using a dynamic group and you need to use a CSV, and then we go to this link and then we get told about some hardware hash thing. Let's start from scratch. I mentioned that Microsoft have made it intentionally difficult for you to add devices to this list. Why is that? Why do they want to make it difficult for you to add things? Aside from the fact that they don't want you to add devices to this list because it's not normally the thing you should be doing in a day-to-day operation, why? Well, because if a device is in this list, when it gets turned on into the out-of-box experience, it will join your tenant. So if you add a device to this list that you don't own, it will join your tenant. You'll effectively make that device yours just by adding it to this list. That's a bit risky, and that applies to every Windows Pro and Enterprise device in the world. So you can imagine that Microsoft want to do a few checks and balances to the information before it gets uploaded to this site. And so what Microsoft have introduced, or at least they introduced 6 years ago, was the concept of a hardware hash. And a hardware hash isn't a hash in the true sense of a hash, if you know what that is. It's really just a hash of the information. It just hashes all the information together and puts it in a format that isn't really user-friendly. So for example, it puts together the serial number, the manufacturer, the model, and the date and time that you collected it into a hash, or at least a value that's been created from those. And then you would upload that into Intune. So it's not really a hash, but it is the values that can be understood by Intune that have been collected from a device. So in testing, we do actually need to use that hash. It's quite common for people when they're testing Autopilot to have to grab that hash from their virtual machines or from their test computers. So let's do that. And so over to my virtual machine. Now, this is a virtual machine that is still at the out-of-box experience screen. It's not been logged into. We haven't configured it at all. So I need to collect some information from this device. I need to run a PowerShell command. And well, I don't want to build this device and go through all this configuration to create a user and then extract the information that way. There must be a quicker way, right? So there is actually. So if I choose, well, I'm actually in a virtual machine. So in order to show you the keys that I'm going to be pressing, and in order to make sure it actually works, I'm going to open up the on-screen keyboard. So I'll just grab that. And I just need to make sure that I have this window in focus, and I'm going to do Shift Function and F10. And so if you press Shift Function F10 on your physical device, you would get this. This is a command prompt, and in command we can type PowerShell. There are many ways to get the hardware hash. This is just the one I prefer. So PowerShell. Now we need to set the execution policy to bypass, and that means we can install script get Windows Autopilot info. We need to go through these changes to allow the actual script to install. And once we're finished, we can run the script. So let's do get Windows Autopilot info. Now I could just run that, and if I run that, it gets the hardware hash. Not a lot I can do with it though. It's on the screen, it's in command prompt. I can't really put that into Intune. I could export it as a CSV. Output file, and then type the name of a ap.csv. That would also work. It would let me put this information to a CSV. There you go, done. And then it would just be right here where I've run this command from. It would be there. And if I open that, it will probably try and open it in... Yeah, it's not going to work. So that's the file. You could upload that file. You've got it. But you haven't because it's in the virtual machine. You could maybe put it on a USB stick if it's a physical device. One of the other ways to get this CSV into Intune is to actually get it there directly from this script. If I just go back to that, and instead of typing output file, type online. Here it will install the module for Windows Autopilot Intune to this device. It will then offer me a authentication prompt to directly authenticate to the tenant as a global admin or some user who has permissions to upload devices to Intune. And then I can authenticate and it will do it for us, which is much, much simpler than trying to gather it from this device, copy it to USB. Let's take a look. So I think it's admin-Alan D is the user I'm using for this demonstration. .co.uk. Prove the multi-factor authentication challenge. And very quickly it says it's connected to the tenant, it's gathered the details for this serial number, and it's waiting for it to be uploaded. So it's putting it in the device registration list now, and then it's going to take a little while and eventually come back and say it's finished. We don't really need to wait for this, but you might as well wait for it, and it will eventually tell you that it's done. If I open up Intune and go to the Autopilot devices list, we can probably refresh that and see when it appears. There it is. Just a few seconds, head back over to that, and it says one device imported successfully. The elapsed time was 34 seconds. Pretty quick to get it done. And what you can do now is close that, and we're back at the Outbox experience screen. We should probably reset this device before we start building it. But let's start configuring Autopilot first, and then we'll talk about this device. So now we have the device in the list. Fantastic. These devices here will be put into that group that we just created. Let's go back to groups, and here we'll choose Windows Autopilot, that one there. If we go into it, we'll probably see one device now, which is that original. Oh no, we already have two. That is quick. There you go. We've got those two devices already in that list, and those devices are the ones who can be assigned the Autopilot profile. So let's go back into Autopilot, shall we? Down to enrollment, and we've done this devices thing. Now they're in the list, they're in the group, and the profile status is not assigned. So we need to fix that. So I'm going to choose that device there. On the right hand side, you can see some information about the device. You could even type a name for the device so it doesn't get that silly serial number. And we also have the associated Entra device. This is the thing that has been created as some kind of dummy device ready to be assigned some applications or profiles and that kind of thing. It's never been contacted, so it's never actually booted and spoken to Intune yet. You've seen it. It hasn't done that yet. And the profile status is not assigned. So we need to assign a profile. You can't assign a profile from here. At least I don't think you can. No, you can't assign a profile from here. You need to firstly create a profile. We'll do that next. And then assign that to a group which the device is in. So let's do that. We're going to go back to enrollment. And then we have deployment profiles. Choose deployment profiles. And I have one already. But I'm going to choose to create a new one called Windows Autopilot. Demo. And we have this description box, so you can type a description if you like. And then we have convert all target devices to autopilot. Let's talk about this for a second. When we've added devices to our list, we've added them because they're new, because we've just received them in a box, or because we've just created the virtual machine. Those are the devices that are in the autopilot list. What about devices that you've already got in the tenant? What about the hundreds of devices that you've already got built and in use within Intune? It's possible to just make them autopilot devices without collecting the hash from all those devices or without importing them somewhere else. You can just convert them to autopilot so that they will always, when they reboot, when they reset, they will go through the out-of-box experience as a new autopilot device, which saves a whole load of time. So you could choose yes and deploy this profile to a group of devices that need to be changed into autopilot devices. In this case, in the demonstration I'm giving, I don't need to do that. I've added the device that I'm testing with into the autopilot devices list. You saw that. So we'll choose next. And this is where we can configure autopilot. There's not a lot to configure really about autopilot. It's enrolling the device with a couple of configurations. The deployment mode in this example is going to be user driven. I'm not going to configure a self-deploying device because that is an edge case for autopilot. It's going to be user driven almost all the time. Join to Entra ID as Entra Joined or Hybrid Joined. Again, the normal use case is Entra Joined. The best experience is Entra Joined. It is possible in an edge case to use Hybrid Joined. It's not a good idea. If you're sitting there thinking, I need to use Hybrid Joined because X, you're probably wrong. That's just a fact. You're probably wrong. You do not need to use Hybrid Joined. You could. You shouldn't. So in this example, I'm going to show you Entra Joined. License terms, I'm going to hide them. Privacy settings, I'm going to hide them. These are a corporate device. I've got users who are employees. Hide change account options, I'm going to hide them. I don't want the user to be able to change the account that's being deployed to. So it needs to just automatically configure the device for them. The user account type, they're going to exit the autopilot experience as a standard user. And this next one, allow pre-provisioned deployment. Sounds like a good idea to allow more things, right? But pre-provisioned deployment has additional requirements and additional complexity to a normal deployment. So unless you're actually going to use pre-provisioned deployment, don't allow it. Because if you don't allow it, all the traditional checks and balances, like checking for TPM and checking all these different things, don't happen. So in most cases, just choose no unless you actually do need it. The region, the Windows image that you've deployed or purchased the device in will have a region set. In this case, this is set to the default that it's been bought as, but you can change it to any other region if you need to. Automatically configure the keyboard based on the region. Yeah, it's a good idea. And then a name template. If you want to set a name template, you can. Otherwise, you get the standard name that Microsoft provide, which is desktop dash and then a random set of characters. We can choose yes and then type in a prefix and then some random characters, for example. Now, it's limited to 15 because device names in Windows are limited to 15. So you want to keep this relatively short. You don't want to make it massive, but you could call it, I might do LC for last coffee, do a dash, and then you can put that little string in here. So this will create a little random. So this will be random, and then this number of characters, so 5 characters, for example. Now, one thing to be aware of is that it won't check that the device already exists before it creates it. So you might end up with a device, it's unlikely, but you might end up with a device that has the same name as another device if you make it 2, for example, and then deploy 25 devices. It's not going to check that the device already exists. So make it relatively long from a random character perspective if you've got lots of devices. Just common sense. So that's that. We'll choose next. And assignment, we already have the group. All we need to do is deploy it to that group. So we'll find Windows Autopilot device. There it is. I also have these. I have just glossed over the fact that they exist. This is to do with Autopilot v2 or the device preparation feature that we are going to talk about later on, but it's not related now. So forget they're there. Choose select, choose next, choose create. That's then done, and after a little while, because those devices are in the group that is targeted, then this will change to assigned. That should happen pretty much now, actually. And go back into enrollment. We should find these devices. These are set to not assigned, and they will eventually, soon, change to assigned. While we wait for that to happen, bit more config, won't take long. Choose enrollment. You'll notice I have enrollment status page. The enrollment status page allows us to kind of prevent the user from logging in until stuff's configured and ready. And you might want that to happen if you're deploying like a VPN or some antivirus software or something that you want to make sure is definitely on the device before the user logs in. In most cases, users aren't going to get their device, log in, and start using all their applications at once. So if you have like 10 applications that need to be on the device for them to do productive work, that's different from they need to be on the device before the user logs in. Those are 2 separate instances, right? So we might have antivirus software as a good one, a VPN as a good one, but things like Chrome and all the other browsers that they might want, and then all the different notepad applications they might need, they don't need to be on the device the second the user logs in for the first time. They can arrive within a few minutes of the device being provisioned. So we could use the enrollment status page, and it's a good idea. It's assigned to all users by default. If we go into it though, you can see it's actually not on by default, and you don't need to have it on. It's not a requirement. And in fact, just to keep this simple, I'm not going to enable the enrollment status page, and we'll just see the device provision without it. So back to device enrollment. The Intune connector for Active Directory, I don't want to talk about it because it's not something you should be using. If you are using it because you happen to need a hybrid autopilot, great, but this isn't the video for you. So on to the next step. Applications. Now, if we go into the apps section, I've got a few Windows applications that are already built by Robopack and various others. We can deploy these to our autopilot devices. We can either deploy them to all devices, in which case I actually have a few that are probably deployed to all devices. This one, for example, looks like it probably is deployed to all devices. But instead of all devices, we could deploy it to that group. So, for example, this Windows Autopilot group. I could do that. And then this application will be deployed on that device as soon as possible. You don't need to have it in the enrollment status page in order for it to install. It will just install because it's a device that is targeted by the application. Very simple. Windows Autopilot isn't really complicated. So we'll go back to that. You can see I've got a few applications that have already been deployed. I don't need to deploy anymore. Some of them will install already. It's very simple. Back to devices. down to enrollment, scroll down and choose devices. And here it says pending. Things are taking place and it will eventually have this set as assigned. I'm going to choose refresh, still pending. Does take a little while. So profile assigned, ready to go. So don't try to test this until the profile status is set to assigned. Notice it's assigned it to the other device, the original device that I had as well. Don't actually know which one that is, but it says it's assigned. So we're ready to go. Back over to my virtual machine. I'm going to just restart this machine because I want it to load all of the information from the autopilot service, and it will need to do that when it boots up. So give it a few seconds, and it immediately starts checking for updates to make sure we have the latest version of Windows. Okay, as you can see, it says let's set things up for your work or school, and it shows my Academy branding, the Last Coffee Academy branding right here. So I can now sign in. Now I just need to type in the username of a person who wants to enroll this device. So I'm going to go with Erin. And then choose next and type in their password. Let me just do MFA. And after a few seconds, it will have started building this device. It has finished enrolling this device into Autopilot. Now, because I didn't use the enrollment status page, you didn't see that normal page that you'll see with configuring your device, installing apps and that kind of thing. The user needs to spend some time configuring hello and getting into the next stage of the desktop. This is when stuff will be happening. This is when configuration profiles will come down to the device. It's when security software is getting installed. Users don't rush through this process normally. So we'll choose OK. We'll type in a PIN. Choose OK. And this is setting up Windows Hello, which is a great idea. It's enabled by default, as you can see, but it's a great idea to have in your environment. Now, it's on the desktop. The familiar Windows 11 start menu pops up ready for us to use. Now, the user will immediately notice that they don't have all of their apps installed. In this case, I haven't actually deployed Office, so that's why Office isn't getting installed, but I have deployed a lot of other applications that should be on the desktop in a little while. The user might be concerned about that. It's possible to use the enrollment status page to kind of delay this process a little bit by just putting a blocker in front of this desktop so the user has to wait until the applications are installed. If you want to do that, configure the enrollment status page. That might be a good idea for your users. If you want to improve the experience by making things faster, then don't configure the enrollment status page and things will just get to the desktop whenever they're ready. It's completely up to you how you use Windows Autopilot in your environment. Let's take a look at how we can configure the enrollment status page. I'll go back to the Intune portal, down to devices, enrollment, and then we have this enrollment status page here. I'll choose enrollment status page. It's not configured for everyone yet, so it's set to no. I choose edit and set yes. Now this means it will show the app and profile configuration progress. It will show an error if it takes longer than 60 minutes. That's, a long time for a deployment. It will also allow you to show a custom error message to the users. If stuff goes wrong, then they can contact you and be told how to do that. You can allow them to collect logs in case stuff goes wrong. You can also block device use until all the apps and profiles are installed. And this is where you set the applications. In this case, it's set to every app that is required on the device is going to need to be installed before the user can use it, which I think is a little bit much. So we could choose selected and then actually choose the blocking apps here. So for example, I might say that they must have 7-zip installed and must have Google Chrome installed. So I can choose select there, and those apps will be installed before the user gets to the desktop. Otherwise, they will get to the desktop, which looks like this, and has no apps installed, and they'll think you don't love them at all because nothing's ready for them to do their work. That's what the enrollment status page is for. It's to put some kind of barrier between the user and getting to the interactive desktop where they think their stuff should be. Okay, that covers Windows Autopilot, at least the traditional version of Windows Autopilot that has been around for 6 years now. And there's another version that came out very recently. It's not quite ready, but it does work. I'll show you it first. We'll choose devices and enrollment, and here we have device preparation policies. This is about Windows Autopilot device preparation. There is going to be another video about this because it deserves more than just the end of a Windows Autopilot video. Device preparation allows you to configure some settings about devices that will apply based on the user. So for example, if we say that, let's go into this policy here. We'll go into basics. Now, the name of this policy is device prep. I've assigned a group called Windows Autopilot Device Preparation, and there are some requirements around that group, around who owns it. It has to be a special service account that owns it. Check out that video if you want to know more about that. In the settings, we're able to specify whether it's single user, user-driven, Azure AD joined. All of these actually are the only option in the interface. We specify standard user version versus admin user. Notice that the minutes before showing an error is 30 now because this is a faster version of Autopilot, much faster. We can actually specify which applications will be installed during this deployment and then assign it to a group. And notice that this is being assigned to a user group. So these users in this group have this Autopilot device preparation policy assigned to them. If you're using normal Autopilot, you can't use device preparation. So in order to use device preparation, the device cannot be in the Autopilot list. I'm not going to show you device prep because I've done a separate video on how device preparation works. Take a look at that video if you want to see it. For now, that's really all it takes to get Windows Autopilot up and running. I've covered everything you need to know and everything that you need to get started with Windows Autopilot. There is more to know. There is more to learn and more to fiddle around with to get Autopilot working for your exact environment. But for now, I'm going to ask you to like this video and subscribe to this channel. I'll get you more Autopilot and Intune and Entra content as soon as I can. See you next time.